you're going to see the intersection of things that we see other people view, whether it's like education, gaming, friendships, like relationships. All of that is now intersecting with the digital world, but also creators, right? Creators who are the first to those spaces. And so not only are we going to see way more creators than we see today, I think as they overlap with what someone might call like the more essential parts of our lives, which again, like I would count relationships in there, I think there's going to be opportunity to monetize more, to actually like build true businesses. And then I do think there's, as we've already talked about, just this huge gap that is being solved right now by examples like Mr. Beast, where creators are realizing that actually like it's not enough to just get a bunch of attention. I need to like build up the skills or partner with someone to build up the skills, to build something that people are actually willing to pay for and build up a true business.
Welcome to Media Empires, where we sit down with the most influential media creators right now to learn exactly how they built their empires. Our aim is to extract the secrets of top-tier podcasters, newsletter authors, and media creators who are breaking the old rules for media success. Whether you're looking to start your own empire or simply curious about the nuts and bolts behind media businesses, you'll find valuable insights and tactics in each episode. Grab your headphones, let's dive in. Riverside is a presenting sponsor of Media Empires. It's an essential part of our tech stack. Riverside makes scaling a media business possible for us and so many podcasters and creators. It's our online recording studio, not just for the show, but across the entire podcast network. Riverside lets us record interviews with the best guests from wherever they are in the world. Our team can also cut short-form clips directly from Riverside, because as any listener of this show knows, you create once and then publish everywhere. Sign up for Riverside.fm today by following the link in the description box and use our code MEDIAEMPIRES to get a 20% discount. Steph Smith has followed an exciting career path at tech media companies. She built the newsletter Trends for the Hustle, which was acquired by HubSpot, and she's now at a16z, where she hosts the excellent a16z podcast. Steph has a distinct voice as a creator, obsessed with data, internet rabbit holes, and the opportunities she sees that others don't. In this episode, we talk about what the future of partnerships looks like between tech companies and creators, Steph's frameworks for consumer media diets, and how to find new content sources upstream of what everyone else is reading. Here's my interview with Steph Smith. Steph, welcome to Media Empires. Thanks for joining.
Great to be here.
So, Steph, by way of introduction, why don't you give a brief background of the last few steps in your career? And I'm curious just how you position yourself and your career and where you feel like you're working towards, like to the extent that you have a North Star or other people's careers that you want to emulate. How do you think about all this?
Yeah, so I'll answer the second part first, which is that candidly, I don't have a North Star. I mean, my North Star is looking maybe max 1 to 2 years ahead in terms of vaguely what I want to do, but also what I find interesting. But I've just learned too many times in my life that if you plan any further ahead than that, then, life gives you a lesson and you end up somewhere totally different, often better than what you could have imagined. But yeah, coming back to my career arc, I started in tech years ago on the growth team of a high growth tech company. It was a developer marketplace. I went on from there and joined The Hustle. Most people might know it as a large business and tech newsletter. I helped kind of jumpstart and build Trends, which is their product, which is their paid newsletter, but it was all around trends that people maybe either hadn't heard of or were on the early stage of. And we kind of shared those trends, but also told people how they could capitalize. Spent a couple years there. We were acquired by HubSpot, ended up leading their creator program, which included their podcast network. And during all of that, I was kind of building my own career, you could say, as a creator. So Twitter, my own podcast, I wrote a book, and then somehow ended up at a16z. So that's where I am now as a podcast host. So that's actually kind of new to me, among that career arc. Like it's not like I had been preparing for years to do this, but yeah, that's where I find myself now.
So I imagine you're a type of person who says no regrets, everything led me to where I am now. But in terms of you've tried a bunch of different things, and some of them have had more success than others. If you could go back even like 4 years ago, do you have a sense for like where you would spend more time versus less?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would spend more time figuring out how to like surface information on the internet better. That's something that I would say like now I would give myself a gold star, but back then I had no idea what information existed online and all the rabbit holes that you could go down. And also just the data that literally tells you, whether it's through SEO, through subreddits, what people are looking for. And so that is like an easy path that I ran into through trends, but I wish I knew that earlier, because that opens up so many doors for you. And then I'm trying to think if there's anything else important there, but I think, it sounds trite, but it's like focusing on what you truly love to do every day. So like going down those internet rabbit holes is one of those things for me, because my career is pretty windy, but at the end of the day, like every time I was given a project where I was like, oh yeah, I want to do that, or in fact, I already do this for free for myself. And now someone's willing to pay me for it. And by the way, like, it's not like I get so many job offers, but I said no to a lot of stuff. And looking back, a lot of those no's were great decisions, because they might have paid me a lot or, given me XYZ thing that looks prestigious, but I would have just been really, really, I wouldn't have enjoyed the role. So that was another thing where I've learned to rein that in more and focus on that more.
Yeah. Every time you say yes to something, you're closing all these doors you don't see. And yes. Similarly, when you say no to things, you're creating, leaving space for other opportunities that you don't see in the moment. It's so interesting. You mentioned on the rabbit holes. I had a friend who worked, I believe for Obama. It was some president. And one thing that he was amazed at was that Obama reads the same news that we do, basically. Yeah. Like, and I've been really interested in this idea of like, if you have a little bit of money that you're willing to dedicate on like giving yourself an unfair advantage, what's like the best way to do that? And one I'm curious about is like, if you could have someone or there be a service that just gives you an information advantage in some capacity. I don't know what, maybe it's regards to information in your network, maybe it's regards to information in your field. Maybe it's, I don't know exactly what it is, but I'm like the richest people probably do the same thing we do, which is just check Twitter. like there has to be something that they could pay for that would like optimize their information intake, their learning, their rate of learning, et cetera. In general, I believe that in the future, we'll all have like personal trainers for everything life, people who are, or AI or whatever, that's like watching us in every interaction, giving us feedback, suggesting what we say to this person, what we say to that person, saying, hey, you're wasting time on this site. Anyways, I know you're a creative thinker, so I just wanted to throw
No, I mean, I was going to say that latter part is what we need more of, because to your point, all of the smartest people in the world, they have access to the same news, but they also have the same 24 hours. And I think where most people squander their time is by basically like overloading themselves, where they're like, oh, I subscribe to like 50 newsletters. I once met someone who subscribed to over 100 newsletters. And I was like, dude, you're never going to be able to focus on what actually matters, what's actually interesting, because you're just drowning in all of this other information. And so it's like the smartest people I know have whittled down their information streams to just the essentials, just the things that are like, wow, other people aren't reading this. And then also using the tools, because like truly a decade ago, we didn't have access to this. Or if you go on subredditstats.com, you can see the subreddits that are growing the fastest. Within that subreddit, you can see exactly what posts were the most interesting to the most people in the last month, the last week, the last year. And that data is like so much more high fidelity than some random person on the street, or even your advisor being like, hey, I heard this interesting thing today, because that's like data point one of one. And so I think that's what I learned, especially during my time at Trends, is like, how do I see through all the noise that to your point, we all have access to all the noise. How do I actually whittle that down to something meaningful?
Tell us more about Trends, what you built there, how you built it, if you were starting it as an independent company in 2023, how you might think about it.
Yeah. Yeah. So I can't take credit for the actual concept. Sam came up with it, and then I was brought in to basically like bring it to life. But again, it's this idea that like there is so much information out there, and at any given time, there's opportunity, right? We constantly think we're too late to things, right? We're like, I thought I was too late to remote work in 2016, right? And like, here we are. A lot of people thought they were too late to whatever, Web3, podcasting, right? But like every day there's a new podcaster who hits the top of the charts. Andrew Huberman started podcasting like a year or two ago, and he was the #1 podcast as of last month, right? Like of all podcasts. And so the point is there's always opportunity. And so for us, it was about, again, where is this opportunity? What is it? And it could be something as simple as noticing that on Google Trends, hard kombucha is trending in California, but nowhere else in the United States. or it could be some of these more macro trends of like, look how many podcasts were started in, 2022 or 2020, and look at how that's changed. And so what we did is we just came up with a list of different tools, and I've mentioned some of them already, subreddit stats, but it also could be looking at the backlinks to a particular domain on Ahrefs. It could be looking at the sales of a particular product or keyword on Jungle Scout, and using that to tease apart what we think is interesting. And then we also develop processes for, again, showing people where the opportunity is. So using Jungle Scout as an example, you can find a particular product that is selling way more than you might expect. Like, it sounds like this niche thing and it's doing millions a month. But then you can also look at the ratings and be like, oh, what do all the 3-star reviews say? Like, what countries are their reviews coming from? And so we built that up over time, and I think it was pretty successful. We got it to millions in ARR. We were eventually sold. And so I think it's doing relatively well still. I don't have access to the product anymore, as in access to the data. But if I were to start it over, I think, like, honestly, the playbook is still there. I know it sounds silly, but it's like, I think there's other companies, Glimpse, who kind of does something similar, Exploding Topics. But if you just think about like the TAM for people who want to know what is coming next, it's like everyone. And so the one thing I would say that we kind of moved away from, that I still think there's a big opportunity to kind of replicate, is just focusing on the visual nature to that. So Charter is a great example of a newsletter that's done that well, but that's focused more on news, right? So like, what company just went public? Like, what does this SEC filing say? But like, I still think there's a big opportunity to use, again, a lot of those data sources and just make them highly visual. And I think people would still eat that up.
Yeah. Sam said in a recent My First Million, like, he thinks there's an opportunity to create more verticalized, like more niche focused of trends. Did you catch that mention?
Yeah, I listen to every episode, as I'm sure you do too.
Yeah. It is interesting. The like, slightly related to that, I've been curious about like, there's so many ideas in people's heads. Like, I'm curious if there's a better way to like use wisdom of crowds to, like, I'll give you an example. Let's say I want to pursue an idea in healthcare. Like, what am I going to go do? What I really want to do is like hear from like the hundreds of people who've spent years exploring these spaces and like understand everything they tried, what worked, what didn't work, like see where all the bodies are. It's like the idea maze, but like, instead of starting from scratch, like getting to benefit from all the people, or even dozens of people who've been through it, who've tried all these things. And that's like, we build like more on top of each other, but that just happens kind of in a vacuum.
Yep.
And then similarly, there are all these people who want these ideas built, who have money and would love to invest in them. And all these entrepreneurs who want to build their next thing and they want to have some traction with it. And so I wonder if there's a marketplace opportunity in addition to kind of like a wiki for Idea Maze or something kind of.
Yeah.
Kind of
have you seen Kernel? KERNAL?
I've seen them, and I admire their persistence in
trying to build that. Yeah. No, totally.
But it's very hard. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think it is hard because as we know, like, there's the seed of the idea, but then actually like growing the plant is much more difficult, but also dynamic than just like, oh, there's an opportunity here. But I do think there is opportunity in matching those two, because even with trends, a lot of people love the newsletter, but then their request was always like, okay, what they would call like, I want more operator focused content. But the problem with operator focused content is that there is no correct like blog post or demo to making your first hire, or to, to growing a company from 0 to like 10,000 MRR, because every one of those companies is slightly different. You're going to run into slightly different things. And so maybe there is some sort of educational resource that fits in that gap, but because it is like the classic, it depends, it's hard to actually build out great content in that domain.
Yeah, totally. I want to zoom out and talk about kind of the intersection of media and tech companies. I'm curious if you think in the future there's going to be a lot more kind of hustle, sell acquisitions to HubSpot, i.e. where these big companies are just going to acquire media companies, or are media companies themselves going to try to become tech companies on top of the, maybe like a CB Insights, although that's a slightly more adjacent, media to data play. but like the example would be like if there's a Lenny Rachitsky for sales, and then he builds like a Gong competitor, Chorus, or any one of these kind of sales tools. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think both. And obviously this is just my perspective, but like, especially with some of the technology advances that exist today, where it's like there's like no code or there's AI, the actual act of creating a product or a company is going to get easier and easier and easier. So the differentiator really, I think over time, as simple as it sounds, is like, can you effectively get people's attention? And again, sounds simple, but is actually hard to do. And I think that's why so many companies, they might build up their expertise in like using HubSpot as an example, building a great CRM, but then they realize, oh, actually, we might not have the internal expertise, but even if we do, it's going to take years and years and years to build up that same level of attention that the hustle has built up. And so let's just acquire that. Similarly, I've seen on the other end, because I've worked for media companies, they are extremely good at getting people's attention, but it's, even with the new tooling that exists, it's pretty hard to build a product that people want and to figure out exactly what your customer base is truly looking for. And so I think they too are like, okay, let's partner and find something that actually fits at the back of this quote unquote funnel. And so I think that'll happen more and more, because also as these technologies are moving so quickly, so is the speed to make these deals or to get the attention that you're looking for, right? Like if you don't, HubSpot might not have the time to wait 5 years to build up their audience. The hustle might not have the time to spend 5 years to build, a CRM that they can sell, right? And so that's why I think those deals are going to be more strategic and happen a lot more over time. I think also what you're going to see is like, I mean, Mr. Beast is a great example of this, but many creators get to the point where they have a bunch of attention and they just truly don't know what to do with it, right? Yeah. And I think their natural reaction is, okay, let me go monetize this content. And I think most of the time, not all of the time, they're just shooting themselves in the foot, because they're basically like, hey, I have this great, like using the analogy of a plant, I have this plant that's thriving. It's growing faster than I ever could have imagined. It's growing all these new roots. Let me just like chop off the trunk, or let me actually, instead of chopping off the trunk, let me like put a tarp on top of it so that it no longer gets sun, right? It's like, no, actually, how can you instead, I don't know, like start barbecuing under your beautiful tree, or like build up a nice home next to it. And so I think they just don't have that expertise. And so I do think that those partnerships are going to be important for creators that aren't Mr. Beast, that don't know how to go and create, their own burger chain, for example.
Mr. Beast acquires some seed stage startup. There's all these jokes. Mr. Beast, saves SVB. Mr. Like,
oh yeah. Like he's like, I've bought like 300 regional banks.
Yeah. Yeah, it is really. I mean, on Mr. Beast specifically, it's like, I mean, he raised money, I believe, at like over $1 billion valuation. I think it's an interesting question. How does he get to like $100 billion of enterprise value? Like at that point, you probably have to build like a real software company or something. Like, and so that's, sure, you could build an e-commerce company or something of that nature, and certainly more content. But can you really like, I don't know, build something like a Cash App competitor or something, if you could find the right people to run it, or something that's more native to him that has just better scale? That'll be interesting to see.
Yeah, I mean, and so the difficulty is, one, building those companies, but I also think Mr. Beast is a unique example where I do think people know him by name. They also like trust what Jimmy has to say. There are tons of creators out there that just due to the way that they've built their audience, people, it's more transactional, if that makes sense. They're like, oh, I'm coming to you to get the latest AI news for the day. And I don't actually care if you've built this product on the side or you're selling this thing, because I don't actually like have this. It's not so much trust, but I don't have very much emotion dedicated to your opinion, if that makes sense. Yeah. And that's just worth pointing out as well, is that some creators will have a harder time not just building those companies, but even if they do build them, having that like fidelity with their audience.
Yeah. And yeah, it's really interesting to, obviously Mr. Beast is kind of like a, once in a generation type person, but then there, people like, I think Doug DeMuro is an interesting example with the Cars and Bids YouTube channel that he has. And then he's building, I believe, a marketplace associated with it. If there can be these vertical kind of, tastemakers or creators who then are able to partner with entrepreneurs and be able to get, not just commerce products, but actually like marketplaces or apps or things that can actually, achieve a level of scale. And it's going to require you sort of just the right partnerships. And that's why I was thinking actually one opportunity could be to create something like On Deck or Entrepreneur First for creators that matches like CEO types with creators who have audiences, and then invests in the top co.
Totally.
I think the creator finance space is just interesting in general. Slow, who we had on the podcast, they're funding creators in they're doing 360 deals where they'll put like $1 million or $2 million in, get 5% of a creator's like earnings over the next 30 years, which is a lot, but also they become, millionaires or multimillionaires right away. So I do wonder if that's going to be the norm. Because even zooming out, like in 2005, Paul Graham identified that like tech talent was underappreciated, like young technical engineers who don't know business were underappreciated. You could teach them business. And similarly, I wonder if today it's like creators. There's no like venture capital for creators really. And but the big question there for me is, will it be equity ownership or like will it be 360 deals, i.e. everything they do, or will it be more just like on a revenue basis or something? Because if it's on a revenue basis, then it's not as interesting. Like I'm curious if there's a win-win for the creator and the investor such that a ton of capital would go through. Anyways, I'm rambling. These are some of my questions.
No. So I think, what you're touching on is, one, I don't think people realize the complexity of some of these deals because they are so ad hoc and directed at a specific creator and a specific company, because every creator wants something different, and same is true for companies. And I got to see, the inside of this as we were building out a podcast network and a creator program. Is just, again, like it was really hard to standardize anything because every creator wanted something different. And so it'll be interesting, as you said, is it an equity stake? Is it some sort of ongoing payment that you get every month that just gives you the stability that you're looking for, and then everything else is separate? Do you own, for example, like what part of the IP do you own, right? Do you own, if you have a podcast, do you own those episodes? But then if you spin off a Beast Burger chain, like, do you own that, or does the partnership with the company own that? And so there's all these complexities, and I think we're just starting to see what some of these deals even look like, because we're really only a few years into these companies and these creators realizing that there's some of that joint value if they decide to partner together. And so it'll be interesting to see, like the trade-offs that different creators make, what companies are willing to spend here. But I think we're definitely in the early innings there.
Yeah. The let's say we're having this conversation like 2028, i.e. 5 years from now. What do you think is going to be like drastically different about how we're having this conversation? Think about like the creator economy at large.
Yeah. Well, I mean, just think about 10 years ago. I tweeted this yesterday. Like, people would literally say something along the lines of like silly YouTuber. And now, you don't hear anyone say that, right?
Yeah.
Because it seemed like a hobby. And I think there's going to be many other facets. Even podcasting. I don't know if you find this, but like since I started telling people I'm a podcast host, they're like, is that a full-time job? And like there is still this like view around creators and what they actually do and how they make money and how many of them really should exist in the world and if they bring any value and things like that. But I think they'll start to intersect many different fields, whether it's education, right? You can imagine like the kids of the future actually just learning from YouTube, actually just learning from specialized versions of, ChatGPT, gaming, right? We're already seeing like esports is another world where a lot of people like took shots at it, thinks it's silly, like who actually does this, just like incels, and it's like not true at all, right? And I think that's another area where like you're going to see the intersection of things that we see other people view, whether it's like education, gaming, friendships, like relationships, all of that is now intersecting with the digital world, but also creators, right? Creators who are the first to those spaces. And so not only are we going to see way more creators than we see today, I think as they overlap with what someone might call like the more essential parts of our lives, which again, like I would count relationships in there, I think there's going to be opportunity to monetize more, to actually like build true businesses. And then I do think there's, as we've already talked about, just this huge gap that is being solved right now by examples like Mr. Beast, where creators are realizing that actually like it's not enough to just get a bunch of attention. I need to like build up the skills or partner with someone to build up the skills to build something that people are actually willing to pay for and build up a true business. So I'm not sure exactly what that will kind of shake out to be, but I don't think, the same way we said silly YouTubers, I don't think we're going to be saying that anymore about podcasting. I don't think we're going to be saying that anymore about esports. And I think like the term creator is way too broad. There's going to be many, like, I guess, more specific titles that people call themselves that are going to be really like solid jobs, if you want to call them that.
Yeah. From your lips to God's ears in terms of people taking podcasting more seriously.
Yeah.
I'm just teasing. I was also going to joke. There are a lot of incels in esports, but there are a lot of wealthy incels, and now they're not incels anymore. But
well, I mean, there's all types of, like versions of this too, right? Like, I think another interesting aspect of, have you been following like the digital virtual influencer side of this whole thing, where it's like you don't even have to be.
I invested in the little Michaela company, Brud, and I saw your great episodes with them. So yeah, I don't know, you're excited about them.
Yeah, well, I mean, I just think it's, if we talk about like, I guess as people have like these derogatory statements about people online and like what, the type of person you might expect online, I just think that's changing. But it's also important to remember that like you no longer need to represent yourself as yourself online. And that's a whole new wave of like interesting repercussions, but also I think opportunity.
Yeah. Like I remember hearing something about lines of like plastic surgery is like just up and to the right for a very long time in terms of people augmenting their human self. Like imagine, how much easier it is to do digitally and, and thus,
and reversible and like can change daily. And you also, one aspect I think about the whole digital human world is that I think we're still in this like very skeuomorphic phase of it where we're like, oh yeah, like let's take plastic surgery from like meat space and let's put it in the metaverse. But I think, if you read like Neil Stephenson's book Snow Crash, it's like actually that metaverse, like you didn't even need to look like a human, or you didn't need to like be the same gender, or that could change the next day, or like we don't need to have all of the same like physics even from like the earth that we live in. And that introduces a bunch of other questions, but I just think we're still in this like, especially with AI, this skeuomorphic phase where we're like just copying what we see in real life. And I'm excited for creators over the next couple of years to rethink that.
Yeah. If you, shifting gears a bit, if you had to leave your great podcast at a16z and start a company and you were unconstrained by talent or resources or expertise, and let's say it broadly in the space of media, creators, kind of the space we've been talking about, and you could incubate multiple companies, like what's one that you would want to start or see started?
Well, I hate to take my example from trends before, but I still think, and this was like an ambition back then that we never ended up doing, but I still think there's just like so much opportunity to take the data online and build companies around that. And I think you literally could call it like the subreddit company. Like there's a subreddit around like beauty trends, and we took a bunch of our like trends that we would share in the newsletter from there about different chemicals like AHA, BHA, things like that had taken off there. And I even remember like sharing with the team, like we should totally start like a skincare company called like the subreddit like skincare company or something like that. We could come up with a better name, but the point is like it's of the people. It's like we're discovering things on the ground. We're building this with people who are part of this community, and those communities are huge, by the way. But there was so many other subreddits where I would love to, if I truly was unconstrained by talent, is just like every week there's like me and some other person, we're sitting down, we're reviewing all of the data from Reddit the prior week, and then we're kind of cross-referencing that with other information that you have, whether it's again like from Google or doing competitive research. And then at the end of the week, it's like we spin off one new company, we bring in like whatever talent we need, and then we grow it. And there's just so many like random things. Like I think a lot of people when because I've shared this concept before, they're like, oh, so you just like run all these like huge companies, and it's like, no, you can find all these like tiny little ideas. One example was like, one time I found like this hinoki oil, which is this oil in Japan, which like if you've ever heard of forest bathing in Japan, it's like doctors literally prescribe a walk in the forest, and it's because the trees there, other than just being outside, have this like, they're hinoki trees. There's this hinoki oil that causes you to relax. And most people around the world don't know this. And there's, little inklings of people selling hinoki oil, but like that's an example where this information exists online, as we talked about before. And so if you get access to it earlier on and you spin off a company intelligently, like I would love to just have this like holding company that I guess manifests all this like Reddit data in live.
Fascinating. So let's turn another card over here and give some more examples, because I'm not familiar with subreddits, although I should be, meaning I should frequent them more. So you mentioned like skincare example. There's some skincare Reddit that is excited about some specific type of product. They're like, oh, wouldn't it be great if this existed? And then you create a skincare product for them, or like give some more examples of what concretely they're saying that would then inform the product.
Yeah. So, I mean, all the time people will be like, oh, I heard like often it's from other parts of the world. Like I went to Korea and I brought back this skincare product and it has like this chemical in it. But there's tons of other examples where it doesn't even have to be like an independent post. There was one that we saw like during the pandemic. This is kind of like a transient example, but people were just like making a ton of soap online. Like there was this like if you look at the graph, the like r/soap making subreddit was just taking off. Like it was insane, the number of people, way more people than you would ever expect. And so that'd be an example of where you don't always need to make like enduring companies. At least that's what I would think with respect to this concept. And so you would see that and you're like, okay, like let me make like a soap making kit, or actually let me cross-reference this with other subreddit data I have of another subreddit taking off. Maybe it's, I don't know, like some particular like ingredient that's taking off. I'm sure you've seen, like if you listen to My First Million, there's like reports that go out that talk about like the color of the year, the scent of the year. I think the last, like this year, it's like one of the like flavors of the year is like lemon, because that's like a popular flavor from Japan. And so it's just, again, kind of like mixing and matching different concepts that you see either at the subreddit level of something growing or of a specific post of someone being like, hey, I discovered this thing. And you can often tell, again, because you can sort it by the performance, how many people are responding, if it's, the top post for the month, things like that.
So let's say that we had a third person in this conversation and he was in charge, or she was in charge of this strategy. And like, where would you direct this person in terms of where to look? Like how should they be tracking what's happening?
Yeah. So, I mean, you can, whether it's through subreddit stats or there's actually several, there are on that site in particular, you can see the top growing subreddits every single week. So I would be tracking that. And a lot of them won't be super interesting, but every so often, if you're monitoring it daily or weekly, you will find things that you're like, whoa, what is this thing? And why is it taking off? Whenever you have a reaction like that, it's like, it's typically a good sign. And then there are several other subreddits like r/skin beauty or whatever it's called, where I would again revisit it weekly or monthly and look at the top posts. And again, it may sound tedious. You're going to go through a lot of junk where you're like, that's not that interesting. But every so often you will see something that you didn't notice before, or something that confuses you. And you're like, why do all these people care about this? Another example is like, if we're interested in the way that AI is reshaping our world, there's a subreddit called r/replica, because there's this product replica where a lot of people use it to build these connections with these virtual beings.
That's very charitable.
I mean, people can go to the subreddit, and again, I think there will be, for some folks, a surprise as to how big it is. And then also over the last month or so, there was controversy because Replica, the company, changed the way that they actually train or allow the models to behave. And without giving it all away, like a lot of these folks were really upset. And so that's another example where, depending on your interests or maybe even your capabilities, you would track certain subreddits and you'd pay attention. And every so often you'd stumble into it and be like, why are all these people so upset? Or why is there like 20x the number of posts this week relative to before? Let me look into that. And in some cases, you might just learn something interesting, like, oh, okay, they're upset about this, but there's nothing to do. But in other cases, you will stumble across like a concrete opportunity that you can build a business around.
Yeah, it's pretty fascinating. So imagine you did this idea, you have a team running it, and over a couple year period, they maybe incubate like 10 different projects or something. So the examples I've got in my head right now are like beauty and skincare products and AI OnlyFans. I'm teasing, but like, what are other examples? Like, would it be skewing more towards like beauty or e-commerce, or how wide do you expect this series of products to come out?
No, it could be way bigger than that. So for example, like I think if you were paying attention to Reddit several years ago, I mentioned like I felt like I was late to remote work. If you were on the r/nomad or r/remote work, I can't remember the exact syntax of those subreddits, but you would see a bunch of people who were not just talking about the fact that they work remotely, but you'd be talking about different tools, not just Slack, but like all of these technologies that now we're familiar with. You'd also be seeing them talk about the different like legal tax implications of all of this. And like look at one of the most fast growing companies that's come about in the last couple of years is Deal, DEEL, right? If you were paying attention, I'm not saying you could have built Deal to the same degree that Alex and his team have, but like you would see that a bunch more people are talking about this, are engaging in it, and have a ton of questions about it. I don't know if I can move here. I'm from this country. I don't know what the tax implications are. There's a bunch of people now who have built entire businesses on working with different governments to advise them on this new shift and how to develop, like remote work visas and things like that. So that's another example. I mean, another example today that I'm paying attention to is that there's a lot more people who you could say are like eternally online, terminally online, whatever you want to call it. And I include myself in that. And there's a whole swath of different, you could call it cybersecurity. I feel like that term is a little old, but a lot of security implications of that universe. Now, I don't know what subreddit exists for that. I'm sure one exists. And I'm sure there's a lot of people talking about SIM swapping, a lot of people talking about like, oh man, my grandma got hacked from this thing. And I think that's another area where like, again, it's much broader than like, I know it sounds silly to talk about like hinoki oil or like soap making. There's a lot of questions that people are asking today on these subreddits that tell you what they care about. And I also think that like you keep using Reddit as an example, but there's so many other data points. I think a lot of people really underrate even SEO as like, because it's this like kind of, it's existed for so long, and there's all these large agencies that do it in this like very boring way. But imagine if you like wanted to build a business and you wanted to know exactly what people are looking for, the problems they're running into, how frequently they're running into it, what related problems they have. That's all in search data. All of those questions are answered. And so I think that's another example of like, again, it's not just the like soap making or hinoki oil. I think depending on your interest, you can really go down any rabbit hole.
Fascinating. Would you consider competing with the subreddit? Let's say if they're not like, if their users are wanting to be served in like more specialized ways, or even like Reddit more broadly, or do you think these are too difficult to do and it's or not where the prize is? The prize is actually building things on top of it.
Oh, I think it's building on top, because I mean, Reddit's a fascinating place. I mean, it's, what is it, top 10 in terms of traffic around the world. And I think one of the reasons it works is because it is a place where people don't feel like they're being monetized directly. In fact, I think that's why Reddit ads have typically worked so terribly. Is a place where people feel like they can like share, again, like their skincare troubles or their love for a digital being. Imagine someone posting that stuff on LinkedIn, it wouldn't work, right? And I even like to think about, this is from a long time ago, but there is this like arc of different media properties. Like I think it's probably like 8chan, 4chan, maybe something in between, and then like Reddit, and then Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn. And it also has to do with anonymity. Wait, I can never pronounce that word.
Anonymity.
But anonymity, how anonymous someone is, right? But it also has to do with like the commercial nature of the platform. If it's linked to other parts of their lives, like LinkedIn is linked to potentially your ability to get a job, how much you're linked to other people in your life, right? So Instagram's pretty directly linked to your friends and family, Twitter less so, Reddit even less so, 4chan definitely not, right? So there's this sliding scale, but even if you're going to, because those platforms do have problems, but if you look at something like a 4chan, there's something interesting there. The same way there's something interesting behind these digital influencers, because there's a degree of truth, and you might not like that truth, but people feel like they can share anything that they are truly thinking. And that's where, again, depending on which side of the spectrum you're on, you may have to sift through more junk. But again, there may be more nuggets. Now, I personally don't hang out on those platforms, but I think Reddit hangs out in that really interesting medium where it's just such a massive site covering so many topics, and people feel like they can be, again, themselves
Honest.
to a degree, transparent. And by the way, I remembered my less terrible name for the skincare company. I was going to call it Small Beauty, because what reminded me is like people are constantly fighting this idea of like commercial entities, and people talk about like big beauty, big pharma, big food, blah, blah, blah. And so that's even like you could call your like, rinky dink subreddit company like Small X, because I think even just that positioning, that branding, people would resonate with.
Yeah, that's cool. Do you think trends could work as a podcast? And more broadly, I'm curious how you think about just like, I know your frameworks for thinking about this like newsletter versus podcast, like the different mediums and what they are best suited for. And
yeah, so that's kind of what My First Million was to start. If you go back, well, the very beginning was an interview style show that Sean ran. And then one day him and Sam just started riffing, talking about business ideas, and people loved it. And so that's another example where I even talked about trends evolved over time. And in both cases, it wasn't necessarily better or worse. I mean, in fact, for My First Million, people love it now, and they still definitely cover business ideas. But it did deviate from what it originally was, and people liked both. So point being that, like, I think there's definitely opportunity for someone to recreate that to a dimension. I will say, to answer your question about different mediums, and I think often people are like, oh, I'm a content creator, or they really bunch or bundle, whether it's a podcast, a newsletter, a YouTube channel, a blog, all in one thing. And they're not. The same way there's that spectrum of like 8chan to LinkedIn, there's a spectrum, and the spectrum that I see with this type of content, or like the types of content out there, is that there's a depth of connection, and podcasting sits on one side of that. So just think about how much time you spend with a podcaster. I mean, if someone made it to this far in the episode, they've probably listened to me for, tens of minutes, if not an hour, if not more. And so you spend a lot of time with people as a podcaster, versus if you're writing blog articles, you might not even know who wrote it. You might have discovered it through some platform like Hacker News or Reddit and just been interested in the information, not necessarily the connection. And so I often give the analogy that like podcasts are like your best friends. You have a few of them, and that relates to even people's listening habits, right? So you listen to like 6 to 8 podcasts, and you only listen to those, and you listen to them religiously. Then there's, I think, newsletters, which is somewhere in the middle. So there is some consistency to that behavior. You expect it in your inbox, but that's more like a coworker. So like you don't have that same level of depth. You're not going to share your like all your thoughts and your feelings, but you have a connection. You like the person, and you see them every so often. And there's also a certain constraint to what you expect them to talk to you about. And then finally, on the other end of the spectrum, I mentioned blogs. That's like the person you meet at a conference every so often. There's even more of a constraint on what you expect them to talk to you about. And then there's even more of a constraint on how often you interface with that person. And you can work your way down, right? But it's harder to work your way up, if that makes sense. It's way harder to just start with a podcast and make, thousands or millions of quote unquote best friends.
Yeah, that's a very helpful framework. So I'm incubating this little media company here. I'm definitely inspired by kind of the model that Workweek has set out and followed others. And I'm excited to do it because I think it's a valuable business. I'm also excited because I think it's very strategic to investing more broadly. And I want to find the Lenny Rachitskis or Packy McCormick's or Harry Stebbings or Steph Smiths. And I'm curious how you would recommend thinking, like, I could either like go all in on podcasts and build a podcast network, although I'm curious, like, what is the prize there? How do you compare like a podcast network versus the newsletter network in terms of like what is worth doing? What are the different like economic or strategic value to those?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that building a successful podcast network is much harder. It now can be much more valuable in terms of, remember what I said before about how many creators will get to the point where they do try to monetize or build a business behind it, but they don't actually have that fidelity. They don't have that trust
Right.
or engagement. And so I guess the way I would position it, if we use that same spectrum, like if you have a bunch of successful blogs, it's going to be way harder to build businesses off of those. Now, there's kind of like an offshoot of blogs that exist, which is like affiliate marketing, and those can be extremely successful, like NerdWallet. But barring that, if you're going more the creator route and like the personality driven route, then building successful blogs or written content is going to be easier, partially because of the analytics or the tooling that exists. But also, as I mentioned, because it's much easier to interface with 1 million people once a month than it is to interface with 1 million people for an hour once a week, right? To have that attention share. And so it's not to say that one's right or wrong, but generally what I do tell people is that if they are going to build a podcast, or in this case, a podcast network, to do that alongside another content type that's easier to grow. And then that's what you build your funnel. I mean, even if there's exceptions to this, but if you actually Google top podcasts in the world, and I'm not just talking about tech podcasts, but the top podcasts out there, most of them had either the benefit of a large network like iHeart that they joined that already had that audience share, or they had that like they're an Obama, or there's someone that is really well known where they brought that audience. And so again, it's not just like scare people away and say it's impossible, but it's much easier. Like my first million started on the back of the hustle, really.
Right. Yeah, it is interesting. I mean, let's say that you owned a podcast network that did kind of two genres of podcasts, and it did it really well. It did like this week in crypto, this week in AI, this week in bio, like for every sector. Mm-hmm. And it was like experts talking, et cetera, like all in for every category. And you did like the definitive like CMO show, CTO show, like for every position. So you had like strong networks in all those spaces and in different sectors. What would you build on top of that if that was already like established and those were like the leading podcasts of their like different niches or positions, categories?
I mean, the easiest thing to build on top of that, if you like just go down the further content funnel, is like events, because all those people want to meet each other and have the same ideas and problems. But then I know it's kind of like one of those it depends situations that people don't love, but like I would go call up, a bunch of those people who listen to the podcast and just ask them about their day and ask them to just like literally walk me through your day. And then from there, you would find all of the little issues that they run into, and I would build products around that. Or, if they're a well-known role like a CMO, I bet you, I can almost guarantee there is a CMO subreddit. I would go pouring into there and find some information there as well. But I mean, it depends answer, because each of those audiences are going to want something totally different. What I will say I wouldn't do, which is it's like the easy route, but it doesn't work because it's so easy, is like I definitely wouldn't go the route that a lot of podcasters do, which is like, let me create a bunch of merch, or like, let me create t-shirts. Because like no one wants that, right? They want you to solve their problems. This, but I know that like, well, I mean, podcasts definitely end up going that route.
Yeah, it is interesting. I'm curious how much like sports media, like things like Barstool or The Ringer, and there are also other examples of sports companies that got rid of Bleacher Report, The Athletic, like apply over to tech and business, and like in terms of that, and if sports is like 5 years ahead or 10 years ahead, or if it's really just like something totally different, because there were some big outcomes there, and tech media we haven't seen a ton outside of some individuals.
Yeah, and I'm not perfect at this either. I'm still figuring it out, but I think one of the reasons that has not happened in tech is because we take ourselves too seriously at points. And if we use the same framework about like podcast being your best friend, you don't want to hang out with that best friend who's always trying to talk to you about the same topics. You want to enjoy yourself around your best friends. And I do think that's something inherently different about podcasting relative to other forms of media. If you listen to a sports podcast, if you listen to a podcast about fashion or beauty or surfing, a lot of these other topics, they're fun, they're hilarious. And I actually think like the All In podcast is actually an example of that, of why like as soon as you brought together the information but paired with entertainment, that you actually like, you wanted to be there. You weren't saying, hey, I'm trying to convince myself to listen to this podcast because I feel like I should stay up to date with autonomous driving. You're saying, oh, I'm actually excited. It's Saturday morning. All In just dropped. Like, I'm going to throw this on the TV and I'm going to watch it with my family, right? Or like my husband. And so I think that's actually really important, and something, again, I'm still figuring out because I'm in this space, right? Like, I'm trying to cover intellectual ideas that are important to people, but also do so in a way that they want to come back to. And so coming back to your question, I don't think tech is inherently different. I think there can be incredibly large media companies built around this idea of technology and keeping up with it. I just don't think we've cracked the code yet, or there's been a large scale example of it working.
Yeah, that's well put. At this point, I will tell the listener, if you're still listening to this, you're my best friend.
Yeah.
You're having so much fun right now.
That's so funny. But I mean, even like if you use the examples of like what people end up building on the top of these other like industries, it's not unique. Like whether it's like celebrities or in the athletic space, like they all end up selling some alcohol brand because it's just like, at the end of the day, once you have that attention, I mean, it's better if you create a product that is catered to your audience, but it's a lot harder to do that. So a lot of people are just like, well, we have this audience and they like us. They're our best friend, the same way that your best friend, even if they are the person who's the most intelligent about like insert technical topic here, if you trust them and they suggest like a new bar or a new workout spot, like you're still going to take that recommendation, right? You're not just going to be like, oh no, I only listen to you about this one thing.
Yeah. And my hope is that the analytics are just improves such that, we can just better understand our audiences, because the people that listen to our podcasts are smart, competent, and, wealthy people, certainly relative to more mainstream shows.
Yeah.
So that's a big open question. Just to pause as we're getting towards the end, is there anything we did not cover that is top of mind for you?
Well, I think maybe if people got this far, they're interested in understanding like how content's evolving and how maybe they can get involved. And I don't have all the answers here, but kind of tacking on to what I just said, I feel like there's not enough creativity given the new tools that we have today. For example, I mentioned like the term skeuomorphism earlier, but it's like we're just taking like with the example of newsletters, what used to exist in a newspaper and like replicating that in an email. And I just feel like I can give a couple examples, but I feel like we can be much more creative in what we actually do to utilize these tools. Like someone should run with this because I think it would work. I could be wrong, but like I think there should be a newsletter that the whole newsletter every single day is just one survey question, like a multiple choice survey question. And every day people come back to see the results from the prior day. And maybe there's some like commentary on that, but that's all it is. And especially as we talked about like virtual humans, a lot of people I think want to know what people actually think more and more. And so like, that's just like such a simple example where today we actually have polling that you can do within a newsletter, which you could not do before. You can't poll a physical like newspaper. And so you can ask, like we did this for a little bit at The Hustle, but just like, what kind of milk do you drink? And then you can literally get data on like how oat milk is taking off, or like how, different people have a perspective on like the future of AI. It could be anything, right? But I think that is like such a simple modification to like the way people write a newsletter today. And there's infinitely more creative ways than that example of how people can actually use the new tools that exist to do something net different. So I guess that's the only thing I would add and encourage.
Ayla is a person on Twitter who's built a massive following doing fascinating and very odd at times polls.
Oh, really?
Well, she does other stuff too, but it's fascinating to see the outputs of the polls, and it's like because I'm not even going to talk about what some of the polls might say, but you're so curious as to what people will say.
Yeah.
And that's just a version of it. But yeah, getting like, finding out what humans think on a topic is fascinating. So that's a really good idea.
And even we talked about like the content format. that particular idea is perfect for newsletters because it is something that people come back to, versus if you did that on Twitter, as she does, like you have to almost like, well, I guess Twitter shows you the results, but if you wanted to see the final results, you'd have to come back or like remind yourself or something like that. And so, yeah, I think that's another way of just like thinking, what medium is this actually best fit for as well?
If you were starting like a tech media company today, like how might you go about it if you're trying to do that as an independent company or just like tech media in general?
Yeah, so I mentioned before how I think that a lot of times in tech, and again, I'm not perfect. I'm sure people can surface tons of examples of where I've done this wrong, where I've not followed my own advice. But I think what we saw Barstool as an example do really well is drive everything through a personality. And so if I were starting a like media brand, I think what a lot of people do is they focus too much on the content, like, oh, what topics are we going to cover? Like, how are we going to break this apart? What's like the site taxonomy, all this stuff, all things to consider. What I would start with is just like a few folks that you think are incredibly compelling, right? And you can figure out what they cover and you can train them on certain topics as well. But like, I would find like 3 people that you already like follow on Twitter, or if you don't know them and you want someone specifically on a specific topic, like again, that's where communities come into play. I know you're a community expert, but like I would go find those people first, and then I would work with them to figure out like what you want to build with their expertise. But I think that's what draws people in, is that like, again, wanting to follow someone. People don't follow Mr. Beast because they do follow him because he's a creative genius, but they also follow him because of him in those videos. And so I think that's where a lot of companies go wrong, because again, they're focused too much on like not that, in fact, right? In fact, they like hide the personalities behind some byline or something like that. So I would personally start there if I was to give you any advice, but there's endless other things to consider outside of that, of course.
No, that's great advice. Steph, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. For people who want to follow your work, they can listen to the great a16z podcast. They can follow you on Twitter and anywhere else you might point them.
Yeah, I mean, all of the links related to me are at my website, stephsmith.io. And yeah, if you want to listen to my attempt at doing media, you can give the a16z podcast a shot.
And your other podcast that you have with your partner.
Yeah, I have one with my husband called The Shit You Don't Learn in School. Exactly.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Steph.
Thank you.
Riverside is a presenting sponsor of Media Empires. It's an essential part of our tech stack. Riverside makes scaling a media business possible for us and so many podcasters and creators. It's our online recording studio, not just for the show, but across the entire podcast network. Riverside lets us record interviews with the best guests from wherever they are in the world. Our team can also cut short-form clips directly from Riverside, because as any listener of this show knows, you create once and then publish everywhere. Sign up for Riverside.fm today by following the link in the description box and use our code Media Empires to get a 20% discount.